Tell me, what is the point of autofocus if it's going to automatically focus on nothing? Hoping for more success on this day. Anyway, there's something up with Jack Marston, I reckon. What is it? We'll get into that. But first, I feel the need to address that there is no character in this franchise that is so mentally ill that I can talk about them for an hour long. Dutch van der Linde is a unique concoction of unwell, and it is hard to ignore. Am I right about my proposition of it being bipolar 1? Maybe, maybe not, but I made my point. Currently, the point is that while I certainly believe that many a member of the van der Linde gang are struggling mentally to some capacity, some more than others, I am working with a lot less material when it's anybody but Dutch. That man is so mentally ill. He also has markedly much more screen time than most people outside of the main characters. So, I mean, the van der Linde gang and their fictional outlaw lifestyle by proxy is a hotbed for mentally unwell individuals. From Sadie Adler, who's dealing with the immediate fallout of a highly traumatic sequence of events, to Reverend Swanson, who's struggling with addiction, and who knows what else, not to mention our very own John and Arthur. In their cases, we get a little more history and context than we do with someone like Orville, or even Sadie. We get to learn about their upbringings, and we can use that information to inform a hypothesis about what we think might be going on. Typically being raised in a destabilized environment, apparent neglect in John's case, and implied childhood abuse in Arthur's, both going on to be raised outlaws in their adolescence, is conducive with negative mental fallout. While undoubtedly not unique upbringings for the time, and certainly not in their social circles, it makes it no less traumatizing on a developing brain. In Arthur's case, we see a deeply negative self-view, as well as a detachment from trauma so profound that we as the player learn about major facts about him sparsely and randomly in the most gut-wrenching manners possible. This prompt during Archaeology for Beginners was akin to being slapped in the face with a fish. And then you play Red Dead 1 and John drops the line about his daughter like it's nothing, and I'm like, hold on. Also, I'd like to talk about that one day. Anyway, detachment from trauma, relational struggles to some degree, emotional repression, and one could argue complex issues with emotional regulation as far as anger goes, are all traits we see in both John and Arthur. What I'm getting at is their interesting case studies as far as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, goes. CPTSD is a pretty new diagnosis that's been broadly discussed and debated in recent years. It's not currently recognized under the DSM, but it is under the ICD, which is recognized by the WHO. Many psychologists believe that the presentation of PTSD in individuals who experience long-term repeated traumas, like childhood abuse, might be more complex than PTSD alone. Hence the complex PTSD. CPTSD develops much like its less complex counterpart, however PTSD follows a singular or a cluster of traumatic events. Naturally, following a trauma, someone might be more avoidant of triggers like a certain place or person, as it could result in a flashback and subsequent emotional dysregulation. For someone with CPTSD, they may experience more emotional flashbacks as opposed to a visual flashback that we see as typical with PTSD. People dealing with complex trauma also broadly report feelings of anxiety, shame, and self-abandonment. While John and Arthur, and arguably a few other characters, definitely have the necessary conditions required to create CPTSD, there is one character that gives us a broader lens as far as a case study into CPTSD goes. Yes, like I mentioned earlier, I reckon there's something up with Jack Marston, and I reckon it's CPTSD. I mean, let's be frank, a gang is no place for a boy, as is stated by a handful of characters throughout the duology. And while Jack at 4 seems to be rolling with the punches, it's clear that by 12, the life we watched him live, as well as the implied danger of the life we don't get to see, is taking its toll on him. Now, comparatively to my video about Dutch van der Linde, this video is going to feel a little more speculative and a lot of me wondering, and asking you to wonder with me. In a franchise like The Last of Us, characters give us pretty concrete indications of trauma responses, and they're shown with intention. Whereas in Red Dead, these behaviors are not necessarily the focus of the story, and therefore become a little more subtle and nuanced. As a child, Jack seems to manage all right with the transient lifestyle of the van der Linde gang, and he copes pretty well even in moments where you would think a child probably shouldn't. However, children are generally quite resilient, and it seems to be later in life where the impact of an unstable childhood becomes clear for most people. Jack is a happy kid for the most part, even while his father is neglecting him, though I suppose it's kind of hard to focus on that while you have the support system of an entire gang. However, a gang does lack a certain stability when you're 4? Not to mention the other years he had to live like before he turned 4. And then the next 15 years are certainly not going to do him any favors, so in 19 years, Jack Marston has never known peace. and it shows. We all grow and change, and I'm certainly not who I was when I was 4 or 12 or 16. However, Jack, by the time he reaches early legal adulthood, is so far removed from who he once was, it actually kind of like breaks my heart. No more is Jack concerned with exciting stories and playing with the dog. Jack kind of becomes the exciting story. Really, he's always been the exciting story. He finds himself at the center of this one as we begin it. We see so much of Jack's life, and yet none of it at all. He's involved in very few missions, and we don't really see or discuss how he's coping with things like fleeing from Blackwater through a blizzard. But you have to wonder how such a small body manages such extreme conditions. Not to mention his proximity to death under the circumstances. Jack seems to know Matt Callender well enough to ask Arthur about him, and so my thinking is he likely knows Davy well enough to feel that loss. Especially considering the way Arthur avoids telling Jack the truth about the fate Mac meets.
What did they mean about Mac? Is he in jail?
No, I don't think so. I hope he's just fine where he is.
Jack is confronted with death so frequently throughout the story though, so let's not get too caught up on two characters we never even meet. It's broadly documented that adults who move frequently as children report higher rates of poor psychological well-being and also less quality relationships in life. I think it's also worth noting that not only is Jack moved frequently, but almost every single time he's moved, it's in a sudden haste due to Pinkerton agents being hot on the gang's trail. It's rarely a smooth transition, which almost definitely makes things worse in the psychological well-being department. We can see moments of emotional breakdown where Jack will cry and be unable or unwilling to express why exactly he's upset.
You been crying? Why? Why?
Don't know.
And while I absolutely know that 4-year-olds will cry because you told them that they can't lay down in the middle of the street, I do think it's worth remembering that this is a narrative video game where things are shown to us for a reason. We know Jack's 4 years old because he's like 3.5 feet tall. Look at him. So why is it that we're given this interaction? Now there's implications that Jack is upset over John's lack of interest in him, which I think is almost definitely a or the reason, but I do think it's worth noting that Jack won't say why. I find it interesting that already at age 4 he's internalizing things. That's crazy. Anyway, I'm not saying Jack already has CPTSD. I mean, he might, but I don't know what the first 4 years of his life looked like. I'm simply noting that he already seems to be showing signs of a less than adequate upbringing, which is not exactly shocking given the things that we do know. For example, like Abigail's inability to clothe and feed him at times.
Arthur, just had a few dollars, I could clothe my son. John's useless and I...
It's not long before they're moving again under the threat of my least favorite rival gang, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I will say that this is probably the least chaotic move that Jack experiences, and he honestly seems to manage everything pretty okay considering. Despite the move and the extra lack of stability Jack experiences by living in a gang, yes, surrounded by people who care for and look out for him, he's also raised around people who undoubtedly should not be around 4-year-olds, namely this idiot. And arguably a few others, but you can decide who you'd keep away from Jack if you were a present parent. But anyways, like I was saying, despite all this, Jack seems to be managing pretty okay. But then he gets kidnapped, so...
Where's my goddamn son? Where is he? Where's my son? They took him, didn't they? They took...
Now, admittedly, Jack takes this one in stride, like everything else, and at this point I'm beginning to suspect that his mental fortitude is being supported by some form of detachment from trauma. There's no way you just snatch up a 4-year-old and separate him from the only people he's ever known and have it not be a little frightening, even if he does get slippers and spaghetti.
Pantafola?
By the time Jack returns to camp, he's not only dealing with the fact that he's been kidnapped, but another move, and the fact that Sean, someone he knew and interacted with, is now gone. Though again, Jack seems to roll through this life as though nothing's really happening or going wrong, and I do believe that a good portion of this is due to the fact that he's a child and doesn't really understand the gravity of what's going on.
You all right, Jack?
I'm just fine.
But I also think that Jack's mind could be installing supports to deal with repeated trauma at this point. I imagine it's possible that Jack could dissociate from his trauma, whether it be through derealization, wherein an individual may become mentally detached from their surroundings, or depersonalization, where someone becomes mentally detached from themselves. Not to say that there are instances where Jack at 4 can be seen or described as dissociating. However, by 12, he seems to remember very little of his childhood, going so far as to almost not remember Arthur at times.
Arthur, He saved us, didn't he?
Jack seems to forget large portions of his life, down to the time where he was kidnapped. Thankfully, Jack doesn't see much threat for the remainder of this chapter. Oh no, there was that time that the O'Driscolls attacked and Jack ran straight through gunfire. But he was fine, though you do have to wonder if he saw Kieran's body, and that's certainly something to grapple with at 4. Anyway, it's not like Hosea dies, his dad gets arrested, and Arthur goes missing for a prolonged period of time. Oh wait, not to mention we don't see the move to Lakay, but I can't imagine it was anything but chaotic. And they move into like the spookiest, most treacherous swamp ever, and the gang is lacking the usual support they typically have with people like Arthur, Dutch, Bill, Micah, Javier, John, Hosea, Lenny. The only people who I can reasonably imagine supporting the gang in the same manner are Sadie and Charles as it's described, as well as the camp keepers like Susan and Pearson and the rest of the girls, who are all of course important, but I think you understand the point I'm making here. The point is that the support afforded to the gang, and by proxy Jack, is cut in half, maybe less than half. I'm no mathematician. Before he's caught in a building that Andrew Milton has a Gatling gun being unloaded at, Jack is already experiencing a pretty significant lack in stability. And he still has no dad. And this guy kills his dog. Move him into the cave zone, infested with those weirdos from The Hills Have Eyes. The perfect environment for a growing boy, I reckon. On the bright side, his dad's back and much more interested in being a father now, so that's nice. Will it make a difference? The gang has always been an environment that lacks stability, and whatever little there is dwindling. However, it is markedly lacking during Chapter 6. Thankfully, unlike near every chapter prior to this, Jack's parents aren't fighting all the time. However, now everyone else is, so tensions are high and people are fighting as things reach a boiling point. But now I'm wondering where Jack was when Susan blasted Molly into last week. Are we all grasping the point that Jack's had a traumatic upbringing thus far? No? Okay, I'll keep going. Alright fellas, let's kidnap his mom. Yep, shoot his dad, and everybody abandon him now. And let's send him off with the camp member least capable of protecting him should things go wrong. Also, I love Tilly. She's my baby. But let's be honest with ourselves. But they live, so it's fine. Chapter 6, we don't really get to see Jack at all, outside of the minor camp interactions where he asks if he can enter the cave or play with skulls or be taunted by this idiot.
Don't get lost!
Of course, though, it all works out, and his parents live, and they escape the clutches of the Vanderlyn gang. Before we move on, I think it's significant to point out that this is all effectively childhood homelessness, right? Like, yes, he has a support system of adults and caretakers, however, he's also sleeping outside, exposed to the elements, under the constant threat of moving, which is not only active but imminent. There are times where there are not enough resources for him to be adequately fed or clothed. Many homeless youth have histories of complex trauma, which causes significant mental health problems like depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, attachment issues, and substance abuse problems. This includes children who live in shelters, transitional housing, kids who are couch surfing, living in vehicles or encampments, as well as children awaiting foster home placements. I want to acknowledge that, of course, during 1899, the idea of homelessness was much less broad, and real children of the time were offered significantly less resources than the very few that are offered today. Even today, people impacted by homelessness are often adults who aged out of the very few resources offered to children. It's also worth remembering that John and Arthur, as well as many other members of the Vanderlyn gang like Dutch himself, Tilly, Abigail, Charles, Kieran, and then some, are all individuals who faced homelessness in their childhoods. And I'm sure that people like Dutch or even Arthur would deny the idea that they were homeless, but the point I'm making is that Jack and the rest are raised under conditions that would undeniably be defined under homelessness, and so subsequently the effects of that are going to show up. This may show up in characters like John and Arthur, who have mentioned patterns of substance abuse, or Dutch being Dutch, or even Charles discussing his lack of purpose in life. As well as all of these characters express history with relationship struggles, both platonic and otherwise. It may also present as Jack at 12 having major lapses in his memory, preferring to stay home, possibly to avoid triggers, as well as losing communicative functions while in triggering scenarios. And also he has no friends. Not like a diss, but like the kid has no friends. I mean, neither do I, but Anyway, I talked about this a little in my Dutch video when I discussed mixed presentations and comorbid diagnosis in relation to cluster B disorders. There are plenty of mental health conditions that have similar trait presentations to CPTSD, and it can get especially muddy when we're dealing with comorbid diagnosis. CPTSD can often overlap with dissociative disorders, which makes sense as they both derive from trauma. It can also present similarly to borderline personality disorder, which impacts emotional regulation and self-image, and is also often caused by long-term abuse or parental neglect. CPTSD can also be comorbid with, as well as presentationally similar to autism spectrum disorder, which is a developmental disorder. These disorders often overlap, especially in high-masking individuals who made it into adulthood without a diagnosis, as this often implies neglect or repeated abuse that resulted in the ability to mask. Both of these disorders run in families, with ASD being genetic. And like we've already discussed, John has many of these traits himself, as well as other traits that are commonly associated with undiagnosed high-masking adult autism and borderline personality disorder. Things like an unstable or negative self-image, relational and social deficits or difficulties, persistent feelings of hopelessness, as well as self-destructive tendencies, and like his father, Jack shows many of these traits as early as 12. This could be related to the fact that he lives an unstable life even after his parents decide to ditch the Vanderlyn gang because his dad sucks. I'm kidding. But his dad does keep doing crime, which means they have to move all the time, every few weeks according to Abigail, and we've already discussed how frequent moves impact a child during their adolescence. Again, I'm just illustrating that both the presentation for CPTSD or some other hypothetical diagnosis is present, as well as the conditions that might create such a diagnosis, both environmentally and genetically. Meeting Jack at 12 years old, he's become quite reclusive. He seems to be a quiet homebody. He even gets nervous when his dad suggests they go out places, like riding horses or into town. Granted, I too get nervous when I'm forced to attend last-minute plans that interrupt my alone time activities.
Can we go home?
No.
Jack is often more content on his own now when he's reading at home. There's also a distinct uptick in anxiety when he's away from home, which I think could be interpreted as a subconscious avoidance of triggers or threat. And again, admittedly, when I was 12, I wanted to stay home too. And I still do. However, we can also look at Jack's history and use that context to read his current behavior through an informed lens. For example, despite Abigail and John being rather amenable during Chapter 6, we can see this as something that doesn't last, as we're shown proof of them arguing on multiple accounts.
Come on, John. Please, try.
Try what? I got a goddamn price on my head, woman.
I know all about that.
But also the way that Jack tunes it out suggests that this has been a persistent part of his life. I don't think I need to cite the stats of the impact on children when their parents fight around them all the time, but I think we can use this to come to some conclusions about how it might form Jack's outlook on communication and interpersonal relationships. As mentioned before, Jack seems to struggle with verbally communicating his feelings, whether it be through unwillingness or an inability. However, as he reaches adolescence, we get a more clear picture as far as this communication block goes. After John shoots like 3 guys in front of Jack because he decided to shoot someone a few months ago, A+ parenting, Jack is obviously quite distressed.
You killed them, Paul.
Son, I need you to hold it together.
And while I think it's probably fair to assume that any kid would react like this under the circumstance, I also think it's worth remembering that comparatively, Jack's been through much worse. However, Jack doesn't seem to really even remember much of it. Any mention of his past seems to be followed by some hazy recollection, if anything at all.
What do you say when he asks about Uncle Phil and Uncle Dutch?
You reckon Uncle Dutch will come visit?
I'm going to keep adding clarifying statements, and I'm beginning to learn that that may not be the most necessary on the website youtube.com, as I don't think the user base is quite as intentionally obtuse as TikTokers. However, I also don't remember a lot from when I was 4 years old, and I'm sure you may also not remember a lot. Unless you do, and then maybe one of us needs to talk to our psychiatrist. But also, I don't think either of us are living with a bunch of 2-bit hucksters. Anyway, I think you probably understand by now that what I'm saying is, of course, all of this behavior can be typical, but I'm looking at it with the context and information available. Detachment from trauma often comes in the form of amnesia. I'm sure lots of us have certain portions of our lives that we struggle to remember clearly. This is especially common for those struggling with CPTSD who may have large gaps in their memory due to trauma blocks. However, it's not like that trauma just disappears. It will often sit in our subconscious and impact our emotional regulation skills. Jack may forget large periods of his childhood where he was frequently surrounded by gunfire. However, when his dad shoots 3 people, it triggers an emotional response in him that we could interpret as an emotional flashback.
There.
Jack struggles to use his words and goes so far as to respond to John in hums.
Hey, you know, your mama wants us to buy some old ranch. You read to her about it, didn't you? What was it called?
It might also resemble a meltdown or a verbal shutdown, which is common in autism spectrum disorder. And notably, this is something that he doesn't just do when he's distressed, but also excited.
How you feel?
I don't know.
Immediately upon returning to Pronghorn Ranch following the shooting, Jack chooses to isolate, and we can assume that similarly to when he was 4, he is unwilling to communicate even when seemingly able.
How was the...
Anyway, no longer will Jack be plagued by the consequences of his dumb dad. Parental separation time. Make no mistake, I think Abigail was right to leave John, and people can argue with me all they'd like. However, if I'm in Abigail's position and it comes down to the safety of my child being jeopardized by the consequences of the actions of my partner, I'm out of there. Anyway, not the point. The point is that regardless of whether or not it was the right decision, it doesn't lessen how traumatic it can be to separate from a parent. Especially a parent you've separated from before. This can even be traumatic for children with unstable, neglectful, or even abusive parents. So even if Jack does have beef with his dad right now, separating from him is undeniably going to have some kind of impact on him. Jack seems to struggle with touch or affection, shying away from it, hesitating around it, or refusing it altogether. For example, where some children might seek physical comfort from a parent when experiencing emotional distress, Jack outright rejects it. He also does not want to hug John when he arrives at Beecher's Hope, seemingly cold and distant towards him. But I can't necessarily blame him for that. I'm sorry John keeps catching strays in this video. And also he can't swim. Sorry. Isn't it kind of weird how Jack will have lived at the same residence for at least 3 years and somehow still has no friends? He's just like me, for real. No, but I just find it notable, and something that could be indicative of further relational struggles, or a lack of freedom, or even intentional isolation. Despite him being lonely, I imagine he gets at least 3 years of peace, which are probably the only 3 years of peace he ever gets in his life. But then he's kidnapped again and separated from his dad, so... Jack makes me sad for a multitude of reasons, but the main one is because I played Red Dead Redemption 2 first. And to go from tiny little baby Jack who just wants to play knights and make flower chains for his mommy to an aggressive, angry 16-year-old Jack, it hurts. Abigail describes him as angry and upset.
How's Jack doing?
Angry, upset. He's been through a lot. For a while, his world was safe, normal even. Then it got turned upside down again.
He ain't saying much about it.
He's just been kidnapped. He grew up with the gang. That's no life for a boy.
And it's hard to blame him.
It ain't like the real world's done him many favors.
I'm angry and upset for him, and I'm sure you can tell based on the intonation in my voice. And when John finally returns to his family on Beecher's Hope at the end of Red Dead Redemption 1, some of the first words out of Jack's mouth are pretty much just, "Father, I failed not only this ranch, but you." It's like, hey man, no big deal.
How you been?
Coyotes ate all the chickens and poachers took the cattle. I tried, Father. I tried.
And while John doesn't expect or require an apology for something that I imagine he never made Jack's responsibility in the first place, I think this is the age where the negative self-view aspect of CPTSD becomes really apparent in Jack.
I'm just a nuisance to you anyway.
I mean, who amongst the 16-year-olds isn't dealing with negative self-image? However, if you are getting mauled by wild animals in an attempt to prove yourself to your father, I recommend talking to a therapist.
You're always telling me I read too many books, that I'm not a real man.
I never said that.
I just thought if I could do something you'd like, maybe you wouldn't go away again.
The effects of John's neglect become a little more apparent now, as Jack is being reckless and self-destructive in an attempt to prove himself to his father, a man whose approval he seeks despite remarking about how absent he's consistently been.
Show me and you'll just run off again or something. It's better I teach myself. Don't make no more promises, Paul. I've heard them all before.
And it leads you to wonder just what he's been doing for the past 3 years as far as parenting goes. A lot of the time spent with Jack now, he spends angry, defensive, but also curious. He asks John a lot of questions about a life that he himself lived.
Were you a murderer?
What?
That place where they held it. Boss shouted at a guard one time, and he yelled that you were a murderer. They were angry at you, weren't they? That's why we had to leave.
it becomes more evident that there are just periods of Jack's life that he's blocked out, as he's able to recall stories from Dutch and Bill about what they got up to with his father, and yet he still claims he feels so left in the dark about a lot of his life.
You think I didn't sit up and listen to Dutch and Bill telling all those stories? You think I don't know who you are? But nobody tells me anything. You and Ma pretend like nothing happened.
And I tell you what, I bet he won't forget this. I will attempt to treat this man's death with a degree of seriousness as I discuss how traumatizing it was for Jack, but also...
Let's get him out of here.
No!
In one day, Jack experiences several traumas, but I think he experiences one that is likely more memorable than the others. Beecher's Hope is attacked, and Jack picks up a gun and shoots at other people for what I assume is the first time. And then Uncle dies, and then his dad proceeds to lay his life down for himself and his mother. Despite consistently having rather unregulated emotional responses to violence, ranging from becoming hysterical to being visibly shaken and growing defensive when questioned about it, Jack looks down at the absolutely mangled corpse of his father and then holds his mother as she sobs. And he doesn't cry. He doesn't really react. He just kind of weathers the storm. And one could argue that there could be a degree of detachment happening here. And then his mom dies. Of what? Who's to say? I mean, it's a couple years later, but... And this is unrelated, but it warms my heart that Jack at least had the decency to wait to get revenge where Abigail couldn't see it. Jack abandoning his dreams of travel and becoming a lawyer and putting down his books may just look like growing up to some, but I think the way he not only does all this, but picks up the mantle his father had tried so desperately to bury is emblematic of a loss of purpose or system of meanings. Jack likely feels completely aimless, alone on Beecher's Hope, surrounded by half-memories and ghosts, and so he repeats the cycle of violence. 19-year-old Jack has only become more angry and more abrasive, and I very much would like to go back to the time where he was making flower necklaces for his mommy. Does Jack have CPTSD? Maybe. I mean, I think he and a few others certainly could, as the conditions are right for it. Though, like I said in my Dutch video, I don't necessarily think Jack was written with any specific diagnosis in mind, and this is of course just an interpretation of character traits. But it is fun to overanalyze characters and then throw a bunch of letters at them, isn't it? In my head, I like to imagine that Jack turned like 20 and was like, actually, never mind, this outlaw life is just not for me. And then atypical to all the themes in this franchise, his mistakes never caught up to him and he got to live a long and happy life. Maybe he traveled, perhaps he did become a lawyer, maybe he wrote some silly stories, maybe he even watched the first Star Wars movie. All I hope is that he didn't die to state-sanctioned murder. Please, spare my boy! I know Jack is commonly brought up as a possible protagonist in a hypothetical Red Dead Redemption 3, and I'm telling you right now, the only way I want to see that is if they somehow break the common arc and how these characters end their arcs. Because I have no interest in watching yet another Marston die. What if we just got a DLC where Jack Marston had one singular friend? Hear me out. Anywho, that's all I've got for today, so please ignore the inconsistent backgrounds. You're probably not going to see this one again either. It's a work in progress. Anyway, that's it, bye.